10:05. Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Thank you very much for tuning in on this Friday. Joining me on the phones right now from our good friends over at the Texas Tribune, it's Patrick Svitek. Patrick, good morning. How are you today?
Good morning, Chad. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a quiet up until, I guess, yesterday week in the Texas legislature with the big announcement on a property tax reform. I had Chairman Burrows on the show earlier today. He kind of laid out what the bill does, what the bill addresses. From your reporting and others over at the Tribune, how does this bill look as of right now? And are you kind of surprised at the I want to say the show, not show of force, that sounds bad, but the show of unity maybe in announcing this piece of legislation yesterday?
You know, I wasn't too surprised by the kind of theatrics of the presentation of the rollout yesterday. Unity, and very forceful unity, has been a pretty critical theme of this session so far. And so to see the big three all together, and then to see Chairman Burrows and then Chairman Betancourt, the kind of heads of the two key property tax-related committees in the two chambers flanking them, I think they certainly got the message across that they were starting out very united, especially by filing identical pieces of legislation on this issue. Wasn't too surprised by the effort to show united front. In many ways, on this issue, we're picking up where we left off from last session. And, the kind of centerpiece idea of the property tax legislation isn't exactly different. I mean, it's this concept of rollback rates and limiting the ability of local taxing entities to raise property tax revenue before going to voters and asking their permission. The rate has changed from what the House and Senate were debating last session. It's gotten lowered. It's 2.5%, as I'm sure Chairman Burrows explained earlier. That was a rate that Governor Abbott campaigned on in his reelection campaign, and that he had kind of given the opportunity to down-ballot candidates to campaign on. And so I guess what has changed is that they come into this after an election cycle where they believe they've gotten a mandate on this issue, perhaps a mandate on that particular rate. And, of course, they have a new Speaker of the House, and couldn't help but notice yesterday that the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, just heaped praise nonstop on the new Speaker of the House, Dennis Bond, in his kind of commitment to tackling this issue early on. Obviously, a contrast with the relationship that Dan Patrick had with the previous Speaker, Joe Strauss.
Yeah, just a little bit of a difference.
Yeah.
Tiny change. Well, what has the reaction been from the Democrat side? Because the Democrats, I'm sure, are not united on a 2.5% cap, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, they raised some of the concerns that you also hear Republicans raise, which is that this kind of legislation will really tie the hands of local governments. It could lead to a reduction in emergency services, for example, and that will really put them in a tight spot unless the state commits to significantly upping its commitment to new school funding, which, just to take a quick detour there, both chambers and statewide leadership, have made clear that they're for putting more money into public schools to make up that gap. But the details right now are a little muddy in terms of where they're going to find that money and how much it's ultimately going to be. And so I think you'll hear Democrats raise those concerns about the impact on local government. I think you'll hear Democrats talk about wanting to be more included in the conversation. Obviously, there were no Democrats at the press conference yesterday. And, I think to them it may look like this train is leaving the station without their input. And it may already be too late for them to get a say in this.
Yeah. What kind of, if you're looking at this from a Democrat angle, though, you don't have the numbers to stop anything. You could convince other Republicans maybe to side with you. But just from a Democrat angle, what leverage, if any, do they have?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that they obviously increased their numbers in the House and in the Senate during the most recent elections, and they went up 12 seats in the House and 2 in the Senate. I think that they're going to be able to have a bit of a louder megaphone than usual, and I think that Despite that, there's still going to be a lot of focus on the swing vote in the Senate. Cal Seliger, which we've obviously talked about on the show many times before. He is heading into this session with a pretty fraught relationship with Lieutenant Governor, and so I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on him in the Senate because he is going to be the swing vote on this legislation, and he did not support a similar version of it last session.
So is it possible for Seliger, because you're right, all eyes are going to be on him as this thing progresses. Do you see a scenario where Seliger could be that 19th vote to get it onto the floor and then vote against it when it comes down to voting, for the actual piece of legislation?
Yeah, I can certainly see that scenario. I think that there is. I don't want to say how likely it is at this point, but there's a possibility that there could be a Democratic vote for it in someone like Eddie Lucio, who's shown an ability to break with his party before on some of these issues. I don't want to make any predictions about how likely that is.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's. I don't think the legislation is dead on arrival in the Senate as a result of the situation Cal Seliger is in. But there's no doubt that he is a critical piece in all of this. And the difference in terms of his the pressure he may face this session versus last session is, last session he was, he had Dan Patrick pushing him to vote yes on this, and he voted no. If the pressure this time around, I can guarantee you, is going to be for more than just Dan Patrick, especially when you have the governor and the new speaker, so heavily invested in this. And so I expect, if it again comes down to him, the pressure campaign is going to be a little broader this time around.
And that's what I thought too. When there was a quote yesterday from Speaker Bonin, and it was basically, hey, we're united. Cities and counties don't try to split us. We're united on this. Don't try to split the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House. We're united on this. To me, I kind of read that as I mentioned, message not just to cities and counties, but a little bit towards Cal Seliger, and maybe some of the other more moderate Republicans that you may see in the House of, hey, it's time for everybody to get on board. And, who knows if that's going to actually happen? Who knows if that's actually going to play out that way? But to me, yesterday was a, hey, Republicans, it's time to get on board type of message sent from the Speaker of the House and from the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like many things this early on in the session, the event yesterday was more symbolic than substantive. I mean, if you look at, obviously they put out legislative text, and we can all go through and look at the details. But if you look at what was actually said at the news conference, very little was said about the substance of the legislation. 95% of that news conference was focused on sending this message that, hey, as I said earlier, the train's leaving the station.
Right.
Don't get in our way. So
yeah.
I think that message was very clear yesterday.
All right, so next week it's going to be a very busy week for reporters and those covering Texas politics because you've got obviously the State of the Union address with President Trump. More specifically here in Texas, you've got the governor's State of the State address, and then also you've got Beto, who's going to be hanging out with Oprah Winfrey. So let's talk about the State of the State address. For those who maybe have never watched or don't care about the State of the State address, they haven't cared in the past, what usually happens during this address by the governor?
Yeah, this is an opportunity for the governor to flesh out his priorities for the session a little more than he may have done in his inaugural address or any other kind of speaking engagements leading up to the session. And so you can expect him to very clearly lay out what he views as the biggest issues this session and potentially name or likely name some emergency items, which are pieces of legislation that he will allow the lawmakers to get to work on right away. Now, we know that, the two big issues for him and every other statewide leader are property tax and school finance reform. I'm curious to see whether he gets a little more detailed on those issues than he has in the past. As we've talked about on the show many times, there's a lot of unity, not a lot of detail so far on those issues. And so I'm curious to see if he uses that platform to offer a little more guidance on how he wants lawmakers to go about those two items. And then I'm also curious to see kind of what are the other priorities that he lays out. He suggested that, beyond property taxes and school finance, he's interested in seeing some school safety measures, some measures related to the Hurricane Harvey recovery. And so I'm curious to see kind of what that second tier of priorities looks like to him.
Visiting with Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune. Let's take a look at Beto. He's supposed to be hanging out with Oprah, next Tuesday, same day as the State of the State address in the State of the Union, I think, that he's going to be hanging out with Oprah Winfrey. You've been also covering presidential politics. You've covered Julian Castro. For Beto O'Rourke, is there any chatter whatsoever or much chatter that if he's going to announce his run for president, he'd better do so when he's on with Oprah? Otherwise, it's a wasted opportunity.
There's definitely chatter and increasing pressure, I think, on him to send a new signal about where he's at in his process. I don't think there's a wide expectation that he's going to announce on Oprah. I think people are hoping that he said something new, gives them kind of a fresh, flare gun in the air, basically, about which way he's leaning, because he's been pretty mysterious so far. And I think that a lot of his supporters are looking to this interview, not with the expectation he's going to say one way or another whether he's going to run, but whether he can give them just a little more firm guidance on which way he's leaning than he has recently in these kind of cryptic blog posts and other media appearances.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to watch and see what happens next week. Patrick, tell folks what they can find on the Texas Tribune and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, check us out at texastribune.org, covering politics and policy in the state capitol, around the state, around the clock. And right now I'm focused on getting to New York on Tuesday, I guess, to see this Oprah interview, and then trying to figure out what else the governor's going to say in his state address.
Very nice. Patrick, have a good trip to New York. Hopefully you don't have to find yourself after hearing Beto. Hopefully you found yourself, you know the direction you're going in, and maybe Beto O'Rourke will as well. Patrick, as always, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Have a good one. That's Patrick Svitek of the Texas Tribune.